Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this first edition of the Elpis Law Review online. In this issue we are trying to cover some legal aspects regarding the current pandemic, and it is my task to give you a brief overview of the European Union competences and their options and their limits regarding pandemic response. We have all seen in the last few weeks that the actions the European Union is taking in order to respond to the pandemic are far from being sufficient, far from being satisfactory. However, we will have to look into the black letter law in order to understand why that is the case. We will have to have a look at the texts of the treaty in order to see what the European Union can do and where the limits are inherent in what the member states allow the European Union to do. And that is exactly what my task is today, what my contribution will be about: an outline, an overview of the European Union competences in the field of pandemic response. We'll therefore have a look first at the principle of conferral, which is one of the governing principles of European Union law. After that, we will have to take a short look at the competences in the health sector and in other possible areas that might relate to pandemic response, and then we'll have another short outline of single market law and its relations to this pandemic topic. I have prepared some slides which will help you to follow my contribution, and since it is not possible to have the camera on at the same time as the slides go along, I will have to turn it off, and well, that's basically it. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now start with the substantive part of this contribution, of this presentation for the Elpis Law Review online. We will only be able to get a very brief overview of the European Union competences in relation to pandemic response, but I do hope that it will give us a broad idea of what the Union is able to do and where the limits lie, where the Union can't act appropriately because it simply does not have the necessary competences. First of all, after a brief introduction, we will talk about the principle of conferral. As far as the situation is concerned, we've all seen that after the pandemic started, the actions that were taken were basically actions taken by the different member states of the Union. And those actions were being taken unilaterally. That means we saw very little of a sort of cooperation or coordination of national measures relating to public health and public security, a problem which is basically at the core of European Union identity. Why is that the case? Well, basically the European Union, the European idea, is all about coordination and cooperation. If in a situation like the pandemic, however, the member states cannot rely on the European Union but act unilaterally, everyone for itself, no one trying to sort of coordinate its measures with the other partners, then the European Union is basically having a problem. And therefore it is necessary to understand what the European Union could have been doing, where there are possibilities for future European Union action, and where there are limits that can't be overcome. We should distinguish two situations, probably. First of all, we had the situation in February and March 2020, where the pandemic started and where no one was really aware of what was going on, and no one really had a sound plan in order to respond to the pandemic. The second situation we should keep in mind, and where the European Union competences can play a role, is the situation where we are now, where the pandemic is not under control yet, however, where the structural issues, the structural ways out of the crisis are being designed, and where one gets the impression that at least the political will is there to get back to a more coordinated approach between the Union and the member states. Therefore, the competences of the European Union that did not really allow the Union to act appropriately in the first phase of the pandemic, probably the situation now is a better situation for European Union action, and therefore the competences have to be examined, what can be done basically in this second phase where we are trying to get back to normal. Well, first of all, we have to have a look at the principle of conferral, because the principle of conferral governs the relations between the European Union and its member states. It is written down in Article 5, paragraph 1 of the Treaty on the European Union, and it reads, I quote, "The limits of Union competences are governed by the principle of conferral. The use of Union competences is governed by the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality." And I'm not going to talk about subsidiarity and proportionality here. I'm interested in the principle of conferral. That means that the European Union does not have, as we call it in German, the competence. The Union, therefore, is only able to act within the competences that have been transferred upon it by the member states in the treaties. That means that the Union cannot overstep the limits of its competences, even if the situation would require an action of the European Union. The possibilities for the Union to act in a field that has not been assigned to it by the member states are extremely limited. And in the field of public health, we have seen that it is rather improbable that the member states would accept such an action. And why is that the case? Why is the public health sector still not a sector where the Union does have competences that would allow it to act in a way that is appropriate in order to answer a challenge as the current pandemic? Well, we can distinguish different types of competences in the treaties on the European Union and on the functioning of the European Union. We have competences that are exclusively competences of the Union. The field of public health is obviously not a part of this field of competences. We have then shared competences between the Union and the member states, which means that the Union is allowed to act, and only if the Union does not act, the member states still are able to enact laws in this field. However, the public health sector does not enter into this category either, so it is within the last category, which is governed by Article 6 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which are the competences to coordinate and to support. And I quote Article 6, "The Union shall have competence to carry out actions to support, coordinate, or supplement the actions of the member states. The areas of such action shall at European level be a protection and improvement of human health." Well, we see that Article 6
states quite clearly that the public health sector is not a sector where the European Union is able to enact laws on its own, where the European Union is free, as in the fields of its exclusive competence or in the field of its shared competences, to design, to enact laws that harmonize the actions of the member states. Therefore, the competences of the Union in the field of public health are rather reduced in general. If we have a look at the competence that is relevant in this field, which is Article 168 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, we can see how limited the possibilities are for the European Union to act. On the one hand, Article 168 states that a high level of human health protection shall be ensured in the definition and implementation of all Union policies and activities. That means that the Union, when enacting laws in other fields, has to take into account the need for a high level of human health protection. However, this Article 168, paragraph 1, does not give the Union the competence to enact measures in the field of public health, but it only gives the Union the task to take into account public health aspects when enacting laws on the basis of other competences the Union has got. That means, for example, in single market law. Article 168 in the following paragraphs states quite clearly how the treaty understands this supporting and coordinating action of the European Union in the field of public health protection. This aspect of coordination and supplementing member states' policies is clearly detailed out in Article 168, paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. We can see that, for example, in the second subparagraph of Article 168, 68, paragraph 1, which reads, Union action which shall complement national policy shall be directed towards, and so on and so on. We can see that exactly in the same way, focusing on the coordination aspects. The Union shall encourage cooperation between the member states in the areas referred to in this article, in Article 168, paragraph 2. In the second subparagraph, we read member states shall coordinate among themselves their policy and programs. Still, no autonomous action of the European Union, still only a coordinating action, a supplementing action, a supporting action towards the member states' policies. And the same applies to the relationship between the Union and third countries in Article 168, paragraph 3. The only competences for real European Union legislative action can be found in Article 168, paragraph 4 and paragraph 5. However, paragraph 4, which is very, very narrow in its field of application and which states that it derogates from Article 6, letter A that we've seen before, that is this coordination type of competence. This Article 168, paragraph 4, only allows Union legislation in very restrictively defined fields like quality and safety of organs and substances of human origin, veterinary and phytosanitary fields, and standards of quality and safety for medicinal products and devices for medical use. So therefore, a very narrow field which does not really help very much in in an overall response to a pandemic like we have seen it in the last weeks and months. Paragraph 168, Article 168, paragraph 5, is another competence for the European Union, but it is very narrow in its field again, and it only allows to adopt incentive measures designed to protect and improve human health. That is a possibility for the European Union to act, but again, it is made quite clear in this article, in the last sentence, in the last line that we can see here, it excludes explicitly any harmonization of the laws and regulations of the member states. That means that in general, in total, Article 168 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union gives the Union only very limited competences in the field of public health, because the member states, in designing the treaties, kept this field of competence to themselves. They wanted to deal with health issues independently. They didn't want any harmonization from the sphere of the European Union, and therefore the European Union is not able to do very much in terms of legislation in the field of public health, even in a situation as we have it now, in a situation of a pandemic. The competences of the Union are very restricted, and therefore it is difficult for the Union to adopt a strategic a general approach to challenges like the pandemic. However, the public health competence is not the only competence that the Union has. We have to take into account other competences which are basically can be found within the broad scope of issues that the pandemic is creating. And we have to have a look at the competences for acting in cases of natural disasters, and the general competence in the field of solidarity. And here I would like to draw your attention very briefly to two more articles in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. That is, on the one hand, Article 196, which deals with the Union actions in the case of natural disasters. However, you can see quite clearly here as well that once again, in these fields, the Union has only got limited competences that are a little bit like the competences in the health sector, coordination competences in order to foster cooperation between the member states, and only legislative competences that exclude any harmonization of the laws of the member states. Article 196 therefore gives the Union some possibilities. It does entitle the Union to act in the case of natural disasters. However, again, the bulk of competences lies with the member states. The Union is only able to coordinate, to foster cooperation, and to establish rules, Article 196, paragraph 2, to establish rules that exclude any harmonization of the laws of the member states. Once again, the same pattern. The member states would like to basically lead the way, to be the first responsible in the field of natural disaster protection. It does not want the member states do not want to give away this competence to the European Union. Basically, a similar pattern can be found in Article 222, which is the general solidarity clause, which can be seen as another competence in the field when we are looking for measures addressing a pandemic and pandemic response. Although Article 222 addresses the question of solidarity between the Union and the Member States, and the Member States between each other, it is a competence that does not have a very specific content. It is basically relating to assisting each other. However, it does not create a sort of roadmap for the Union in order to address catastrophes, disasters like the one that we are living currently. So therefore, the primary law in the field of public health, in the field of natural disasters, in the field of solidarity, all those topics that come to mind when we are thinking about how could we address a pandemic, what would be the issues that address this challenge. No competence is really extremely helpful for the European Union in order to address issues of this pandemic. The basically core competence of the European Union, the common market, is obviously being impaired by the pandemic as well. We've seen quite a lot of actions from the member states, actions that were not compatible with internal market law. We can have a short look at those actions a little bit later on. But basically, if you are closing the borders, if you are stockpiling goods, if you are not allowing people to travel anymore, then you are obviously impairing the internal market. And since the competence that the European Union has in the field of the internal market, which is basically Article 114 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the Union, but there are also other competences in the field of the internal market, then obviously the internal market competence is a competence that can be used in order to deal with those impairments by the member states. And there's another issue. If goods are concerned that are relevant for combating the pandemic, like, for example, medical devices, the European Union does have a competence in order to ease the needs of the member states for getting those devices in order to address the pandemic. And therefore, the Union is able to enact laws on the basis of Article 114 and the other common market competences in order to address the problems that the pandemic has created in the field of common market law. And I brought you an example here which deals with questions of making it easier for member states to use medical devices in a way that is compatible to internal market law. And the regulation that I have written on this slide here is trying to strike a balance between the requirements of free movement of goods in the internal market and the necessity to allow the member states to use medical devices even if they are not compatible anymore with single market law, or at least with the latest state of single market law in the situation of a crisis, in the situation of a basically natural disaster. If we turn away from legal actions and if we take a look at the informal action the European Union has been developing since the beginning of the pandemic. We can see quite a lot of communications from the European Commission. Now, informal coordinating action of the European Union is exactly what Article 6, letter A of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, this competence of coordination and cooperation, what Article 168 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the Union, the competence in the field of public health, is meaning. The Union is more or less restricted to informal coordinating action in the field of public health. And that's what the European Commission tries to do. I have taken 3 examples here that can be seen as quite good examples, in my opinion, to what the European Union is trying to do. First of all, you can see these. You can have a look at the guidelines on EU emergency assistance, on cross-border cooperation in healthcare. We've seen that enters exactly into the context of Article 168, coordinating member states in cross-border situations. The Union does not have the competence to harmonize the laws of the member states in this field. However, it can still try to coordinate their actions, try to ease the cooperation of the member states, and that's what this communication is trying to do in issuing non-binding guidelines on emergency assistance. The second communication deals with basically single market issues, however not by harmonizing single market laws of the member states or laws of the member states that are relevant for the single market, but by trying to adapt existing laws of the European Union to the situation we are living at the moment. And this guidance on the free movement of health professionals and minimum harmonization of training in relation to COVID-19 emergency measures relates to the directive which is already there, which already exists on the recognition of professional qualifications. This guidance tries to give the member states an idea how they can adapt the requirements, how they can interpret the requirements of this directive, this existing directives, according to the needs, the specific needs of the pandemic. If they can, for example, make exceptions to minimum requirements, and so on and so on. So it's trying to give the member states guidelines on how to deal with the existing European Union law in a specific situation. And the last communication deals with another element, basically, of the single market, guidelines on the optimal and rational supply of medicines to avoid shortages during the COVID-19 outbreak. That is dealing with questions of the free movement of goods and the among other issues, the problem of stockpiling. Here again, the European Union does not try to harmonize the question of supply of medical devices. They are trying to give guidelines, give the member states a guidance on how to act properly within the field of single market law, on even in an extraordinary situation like the pandemic. Guidelines on how to avoid the risks for other member states that might come along with stockpiling in one member state. So it is basically the attempt to to get the free market going again and to reduce the worst distortions of the market in the first phase, in the first basically installment of the pandemic. And that leads to the second point, which I would like to make very briefly, in order to give you an idea how the COVID-19 pandemic is influencing a single market law. Generally speaking, single market law is, well, the core of the European Union. That is not only relating to the market freedoms, but also to all those harmonization measures on the basis of Article 114 and the other single market competences the Union undisputedly has. However, public health is a written ground of justification in the field of free movement of goods and free movement of persons, obviously. Free movement of services as well. So public health is a ground of justification that can be invoked by the member states in order to restrict the free movement of goods, in order to distort the common market, and it can justify a breach of the principle and justify a breach of the requirements of the market freedoms. And the member states have done so. They have stockpiled, they have prevented goods from leaving the country, they have prevented persons from entering the country on grounds of public health and public security. Now, basically, the treaty allows the member states to do so. Since Article 36, for example, speaking of the free movement of goods, says that public health is one ground of justification which can justify breaches of the free movement of goods, and therefore the member states are entitled to restrict the cross-border sale of goods. Now, the principle of justification, as we know it in the field of free movement of persons and free movement of goods in the field of the market freedoms, always requires a proportionality tests. And there lies the core problem that we are facing at the moment. While it is certainly possible to reduce the free movement of goods and persons in the, let's call it, the first phase of the pandemic, where nothing is clear and no coordinated policies are there in order to address the pandemic. The measures that are very strict, which are very restrictive, become less and less proportionate in a situation like the situation of the second phase, where there is more coordination and where everything is on the way of normalizing. Therefore, it becomes more and more difficult for the member states to justify very strict measures in the field of the market freedoms. However, the European Court of Justice has always accepted that the member states do have a margin of appreciation in the field of public health especially. Therefore, it has accepted measures that the member states took in order to restrict the free movement of goods and free movement of persons in the field of public health. However, this margin of appreciation does have its limits. You cannot use it as a justification for any measure the member states are taking, and if the approach towards the pandemic, if the response towards the pandemic is becoming more and more coordinated, if things get more and more under control, the possibility for the member states to restrict the free movement of goods and free movement of persons are getting less and less justified. That means that the margin of appreciation cannot be invoked by the member states indefinitely, even if the damage for the single market is extremely high. We can therefore keep as a result, basically, that the law of the single market is limiting the member states' competences in the field of public health, even in a pandemic, by the principle of proportionality. And the more and more the European Union is coordinating the member states' actions, the more and more the member states are within a sort of roadmap towards creating an adequate union-wide response to the pandemic, the less and less a unilateral measure being applied on the market freedoms and invoking public health as a justification is convincing. That means that even with this coordinating measures, with this cooperation and supporting measures, the European Union can reduce the freedom of the member states to enact unilateral measures in the field of the single market, in the field of the market freedoms. That's point one. The second point, state aid law and national recovery programs, can be very brief, since we've got a contribution by Dr. Parashu in this issue of the ELPIS law review online. State aid law plays a significant role in protecting the level playing field between the member states, and obviously national recovery programs for the national economies that have been shut down during the pandemic can impair this level playing field. However, the European Union, the European Commission, is dealing with this problem on the basis of the usual usual articles of the treaty, like Article 107, 108 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So state aid law is another method, another instrument in order to bring in line, on the one hand, the requirements of the extraordinary situation, and on the other hand, the interests and the long-term interests of the single market, of the level playing field in competition law. The third point is another very brief point, because it does not really has to do a lot with competences of the Union as far as actions in pandemic response are concerned. It is, however, necessary in order to get back to normal, and that is the EU recovery program and the EU budget. We've all seen the problems that had to be addressed in the last European summit, the last meeting of the European Council in the last week, during the last week, the last weekend, the last week. The European Union is trying to bring back to normal the European economy, and therefore is creating, or has created, a recovery program that is to be enacted together with the EU budget, and which has a lot, or which is supposed to have a lot of impact on the European economy and the recovery, basically, of the European economy and the European Union in general. I have added some further reading for those who would like to go into more detail in this field, and apart from some articles, I have added also 2 documents which seem rather important to me. The one document which is important, obviously, are the conclusions of the European Council on the recovery plan which is exactly this question of the EU budget. And the second document is the joint European roadmap towards lifting COVID-19 containment measures of the European Council and the European Commission, which is trying to coordinate the member states' actions in the field of reopening the European Union and in the field of reopening the single market again. Every time the Union has faced a crisis, a situation where the usual instruments didn't really work that well, we saw a situation afterwards where the legal framework of European action has been assessed, has been evaluated, and finally has been adapted to the requirements of the situation that had to be dealt with. Therefore, I suppose that the question of addressing public health issues on the European Union level will be a question of further interest for the European Union. We have seen that the competences the Union has are rather limited. However, that the use of informal action, the use of coordinating instruments can be quite helpful in addressing those issues, even if they are not harmonizing legal measures like we are used to them in the field of the single market. It is necessary that the European Union is acting coherently, is acting together in such a field which is addressing not only Europe as a whole, but the entire world. Therefore, I think the question of competences of the European Union in response to the pandemic is a question for the future of the European Union. Thank you very much.